Welcome to this epic PC parts guide. Today, hopefully, if you pay attention, you'll learn what all the different PC parts do. There's a lot of them, and it might seem confusing. There are a lot of different parts, and they all have different purposes. Hopefully, this video will explain them to you. The main PC parts are the CPU, motherboard, RAM, storage, GPU, case, and power supply. The first main part is the CPU. A lot of people call it the brain of the PC, but the entire PC is basically a brain, so you could say it's the center of a brain. CPU stands for Central Processing Unit. It is the central part of the PC, so it processes code that the computer's running and executes the instructions that it's given. It interprets the information coming from like keyboard, mouse, and printer, or an app, and then it does what it needs to. CPU can process information much faster than a human brain, although some can do it much faster than others. AMD CPUs are generally better. The CPU sits in the CPU socket on the motherboard, where it can easily communicate with the other parts of the computer. AMD CPUs generally have pins on the bottom, but Intel CPUs have a flat bottom that makes contact with the socket. The three main CPU types are AMD Ryzen, Intel Core, and AMD Ryzen Threadripper. A core is where the actual information gets processed in the CPU. A thread are things that hold information in the CPU, so the more threads in the CPU, the more things it can do at once. And the heatsink is the metal structure on the top of the CPU. The next main part is the motherboard. The motherboard looks like that. The motherboard is also called a MOBO, but it does mean the same thing. It is the component in the computer that basically ties all the other parts together to communicate with each other, and it lets them share data between each other at high speeds. It links the CPU, GPU, RAM, SSD, any fans, and all the power supply all together. The CPU goes in the socket in the upper half, or in the middle if it's a small motherboard, and the RAM goes in the DIMM slots to the right of the CPU socket. A high-end motherboard will not increase your computer's performance, but you will need a working board to keep your computer running properly. On the left side of the motherboard, poking out the side of the computer, the back side of the computer, is the I/O, and the CPU socket on your motherboard isn't the correct one. When you install the CPU, it'll break the CPU and the motherboard, so make sure it's the correct socket. DIMM slots are the slots your RAM goes into. We'll get into that soon. The I/O is the ports on the back of the motherboard, and a PCIe slot is the slot that your graphics card goes into. The next major PC part is the RAM. RAM stands for Random Access Memory, or it can just often be called memory. RAM is where apps on your computer can send information to be stored short-term. If apps send short-term data to your hard drive or SSD, the speed in which the information is given back to the app is way slower. But when the app sends short-term data to RAM, it can be sent back to the app much faster, which means your computer can run much faster. You can get RAM with different speeds and storage sizes. 16 gigs of RAM is definitely enough if you just want to be gaming or anything, but if you're video editing, you might want 32 gigabytes or more. Cache latency is how many clock cycles it is between when RAM receives information and when RAM makes that information available, and megahertz is the unit that the speed is measured in. The next main PC part is storage, or SSD or HDD. It can look like that, or the other picture. SSD stands for solid state drive. There are two types of SSDs. There are SATA SSDs, which are not in the motherboard, they're generally in the back or bottom of the computer, and there are NVMe M.2 SSDs, which have faster loading times, and they're in the motherboard. The SSD holds long-term storage. NVMe M.2 SSD just loads things a lot faster, but it's more expensive, so you might want to get that. And the type of storage device is a NVMe M.2 SSD. It's a rectangular chip that goes in the motherboard. SATA SSD generally goes in the bottom, and an HDD also goes in the bottom. The next main PC part is the GPU. It looks like that, or it can look like anything similar to that. GPU stands for Graphics Processing Unit. Another name for it is just graphics card. They're all the same thing. The GPU takes input from the CPU and other bits of the computer. Once the computer is finished processing information, it can go to the GPU and it can be output onto the screen or rendered. The GPU speeds up the rendering of frames and images so the CPU can do other things and your computer can go faster. Your GPU is the thing that gives you FPS in video games. All GPUs do the same thing, but more expensive ones are generally faster. CUDA core is similar to a CPU core, but it's in the GPU. CUDA core are where the actual graphics processing happens. PCIe slot, this is where the GPU plugs into the motherboard. And heat pipe, they're the things that transfer heat around the GPU. The next main PC part is the case. The case is also called the chassis of the PC. The case usually holds together all the parts in a somewhat stylish way. The on and off button is usually on the front or top of the case. The case plugs into the motherboard, and that's how the PC is turned on, through the on button. All cases do the same thing, but some offer more airflow for your parts. The next main PC part is the power supply, or PSU. It looks like that. PSU is short for power supply unit. The power supply is what draws electricity from the wall and spreads it evenly around the PC. If the GPU needs more power, the power supply will give more power to the GPU. All power supplies do the same thing, but some can't deliver as much power as others. When getting a power supply, you need to make sure that the power supply you're getting can deliver enough power to your PC. Thanks for watching. I hope that it explained all of the details to you.